I want you to imagine that it's Monday morning. It's not Saturday afternoon anymore. It's Monday morning and you're on your way to work if you're lucky enough to be employed. A lot of people are unemployed. But if you're lucky enough to be employed, you're on your way to work. And if you live here in New York City, you're probably taking public transportation on the train. Now imagine yourself, picture yourself there on the subway train, on your way to work in the morning. You look around. Are people happy? Do people want to be there? You're packed in there, right? You're packed in tight. You're going. It's early in the morning. You've got some coffee in you to wake you up. You're on your way to work. Are you happy about that situation? Of course not. Nobody is, right? But I want to take you even further from here tonight and from there. I want to take you to, imagine that you were on that train, but you actually wanted to go to work. Imagine you were actually excited. And you were on your way to work because you knew that you were going to your job and you were going to be making a contribution. You weren't just there to put in some hours, to get some money, to pay the rent, to fill your stomach. But you actually knew that when you went to that job, you were going to make a contribution. And you were going to make the society live in better. And that the work that you would be doing, which you would be paid for, but that work that you would be doing would actually benefit everyone in your neighborhood, in your country, your community, and in the world. Imagine that. It's pretty different than what we have now. Now imagine on top of that, that your rent was set at 10% of your income. Imagine that. No matter what your income was, you would be making, your rent would be 10% of your income. And imagine that you would always have a job. At no point would your employer come to you and say, you know what, no work here anymore. You would always have a job, whether it's a job you've been specifically trained for, whether it's some manual labor, maybe they need you to do some sweeping the streets, but no matter what, they would find a way for you to fit into the system and make a contribution, and you would have employment. You would have a place in the economy. Imagine that. Or better yet, imagine that when the cops came on the train in the morning, you didn't get nervous, right? I mean, everyone gets nervous when the cops come on the train, right? They're looking for, write people a ticket, they're making people nervous, they might grab somebody off the train and put them against the wall. But imagine that when the cops came on the train, you said hello and they were your friends, right? Imagine that. That's nothing like what we have right now. This is a country with 2.5 million people in prison. We have mass unemployment, youth especially unemployed, as the other two panelists have pointed out. Yeah, the people that are, even the people that are employed, it's not secure. Your chances of staying secure, we're in a high-tech economy. The more efficient production becomes, the more machines they invent, the less people are employed. It's like workers and machines are fighting against each other. It's disgusting. And the more machines they create, the fewer people that are employed. But the more people that are laid off, the fewer people that are employed, the less people can buy. And so these products that these machines are so efficiently producing aren't even getting sold, right? And so what is the great subsidy that they have to keep the economy going in this country right now? War. War. Lots of war. They're building drones and bombs and all kinds of weapons. And what are they doing also? They always tell us that this is the great country in the world and we've got our freedom, but our freedoms are disappearing, aren't they? All that freedom we thought we have, now the NSA is listening to your phone. Now when Occupy Wall Street protesters go out, they club you in the face. And you know what? People of color and black and brown people have never had those freedoms to begin with. Let's be clear about that too. But for most people in this country, freedoms are completely being eliminated and we're driving into a lower and a reality where there's much more poverty and suffering. Right? That's the reality of the situation we're in. But that world I described where you're on the train and you actually want to contribute because the work that you do is productive and will benefit the people around you and the people in society as a whole, where your rent is set at 10%, where you're guaranteed employment. You know what that world is? That's called socialism. And they have that right now in Cuba. They have that. There is no unemployment in Cuba. In Cuba, rent is set at 10% of your income, no matter what it is. There's guaranteed housing. Everyone has a job, and people have that level of security. And people had that in the former Soviet Union. They had that. They have it now in People's Korea, and Bolivia and Venezuela are moving toward that system. They're not fully at socialism yet, but they're moving in that direction, moving towards socialism. But it gets to be an issue because, if socialism were just something that was just a beautiful dream, it would really take only somebody with a pen to write about it, right? And that's the whole thing. Anyone with a pen can come up with a model, a blueprint for what the ideal world would look like. But the reality is that and that's why I liked what Ramiro was getting at, and Taryn also, was that socialism, the socialism that we're talking about, is based on material conditions. It's based on actual contradictions and struggles between two things. Contradiction, it's a word, when I first started going to conferences like this and all that, people were always talking about the contradictions. Like, I didn't know what they were talking about. right? But a contradiction, I always thought like contradiction is when I say like the sky is blue and says, no, it's not, it's red. You're contradicting me. That's what I always thought that contradiction meant. But in the Marxist terminology, contradiction refers to two things that can't coexist, right? When one person is hungry and another person has a big stack of food they're not eating, that can't coexist. Eventually that hungry person's going to take that food. That's a contradiction. When two things can no longer coexist, they collide, that is a contradiction. And Marxism is the understanding that history is driven forward, human society, but all of nature, everything is driven forward by contradictions. When two things cannot coexist any longer, they clash against each other, and that's how the future comes into being. That's kind of the dialectical understanding of things. When Marx talks about dialectical materialism, he's talking about contradictions driving history. That's really what Marxism is all about. And when we're here talking, the title of this panel is we're talking about young Marxist-Leninists. Will young Marxist-Leninists be the gravediggers of capitalism? And I'd like to get up here and tell you that I, Caleb, invented Marxism-Leninism. I'd like to be able to say but I didn't, right? There's actually been generations of young people who've organized for Marxism, and adults too, but young people have always had a specific role. And I'll tell you, the first communists, the first young people that were Marxist-Leninists in this country, it was started around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. There was a mass organization in this country called the Socialist Party. You may have heard of it. Eugene Debs, millions of people were supporting the Socialist Party. World War I broke out, and the Socialist Party was outlawed. It was even illegal to send a socialist newspaper in the mail. And the youth wing of the Socialist Party was called the Young People's Socialist League. YPSL was kind of the acronym they used for it, the YPSL. And as World War I was going on and young people were getting sent over to Europe to die and all kinds of suffering was going on, in Russia they had the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The Soviet Union happened. And the question came to Americans or people in the US here in the Socialist Party is, would they support that revolution or not? That was the question. And the Young People's Socialist League voted in support of the Bolshevik Revolution. And they changed their name to the Young Communist League. It's kind of interesting. The majority of the young people in the Socialist Party supported the Bolsheviks. The YPSL, the YPSL, they changed their name to the Young Communist League. The Socialist Party, on the other hand, did not support the Bolshevik Revolution. The minority that did eventually became the Communist Party. And the work of, the Young Communist League, when it began, it was part of a culture. We don't have this, especially since McCarthyism, we really don't have this anymore. But there was at one time in this country, there was a communist culture. There was the Young Communist League was for people that were over the age of 18. But if you were in high school or younger, you were in something called the Young Pioneers Club. Now, I got to say, the woman who actually recruited me to be in the Workers' World Party was an 80-year-old woman, and she had been a young pioneer here in New York City in the 1920s. And she showed me a picture of her when she was about 5 years old, wearing a little red beret, and with her fist like this, right? And she told me that the way it worked was you had one finger under your thumb, and that was for the Soviet Union, 1/5 of the world that was under the control of the working class. And the other 4 fingers were for the rest of the workers who weren't free yet. And she was in everyone in her neighborhood. It was a neighborhood in Brighton Beach, New York, and they were all in the Young Pioneers Club. And they used to sing, she said, they even had nursery rhymes, right? They would sing, 1, 2, 3, young communists are we, we're fighting for the working class against the bourgeoisie. It was a culture. There was summer camps. It was a community of people devoted to fighting capitalism. And people frequently went to the Soviet Union and learned from great revolutionary leaders like the people who had led the Russian Revolution. And it was a culture, and it existed, it was there, but the big thing that happened was when the capitalist economy crashed in 1929, the Great Depression. The Communist Party had already been kind of a culture, they had a base, but that base very rapidly expanded. Why? Because there was suddenly mass unemployment, there was suddenly mass poverty, and they built things called unemployment councils. When a family would get evicted from their home, the Communist Party, the Young Communist League, the unemployment council would come and they would break the lock and put all their furniture back in. And if the cops came to mess with them, why, there was a fight. That was what the Young Communist League did, right? Veterans, a lot of young people were involved in the military and were veterans. And they had something called the Bonus March. And they demanded veterans benefits. And 4 or 5 veterans were actually killed occupying D.C., demanding the veterans benefits. And one thing that distinguished, and this is really important, that distinguished young Marxist-Leninists in the Young Communist League from young revolutionaries in other socialist groups is that the Young Communist League was always very, very absolutely clear that they were anti-racist. The Socialist Party was not anti-racist, unfortunately. The other socialist groups often would make racist statements or say, we're not concerned about racism, you know, we're just for all the workers, well, we don't worry about that. But the Communist Party always understood that racism was the original sin of the capitalist United States of this country. That you can't talk about capitalism in the United States without talking about the fact that it was built on the slave labor of Africans, and that still to this day, mass racism and repression is built into the capitalist system of the United States. And that's why people like Paul Robeson, people like Langston Hughes, African-American revolutionaries were always aligning with the Communist Party. You find very few African-American revolutionaries in the Socialist Party and other groups because these groups were not interested in fighting racism. And the Communist Party was always very clear that it was interested in fighting racism, that racism was a built-in evil of the capitalist system. Now, the Second World War happened, and things rapidly changed. There was a period of great repression in the United States, McCarthyism, it was called, in which being a member of the Communist Party was, I think, about 8 years in prison, usually. The national leaders of the Communist Party were jailed. If they didn't jail you, they made it impossible for you to find a job. You know, people tell stories about, you know, they would get a job, and then 2 days later the FBI would show up and tell their boss, don't you know you're hiring a communist? And then they would be fired. I mean, this happened, right? And actually, one interesting incident is during that period, most universities had a policy that if you were a member of the Communist Party, you would be expelled. And Antioch College, which is a very liberal college in Ohio, made a point of saying that they would not expel members of students that were communists. And it was very controversial, and they were picketed. There were right-wing protests. How dare they allow communists to attend this college? That was the atmosphere. But even in that, you know, the communists always found a way to organize and to resist. And I think, you know, in 1956, the Khrushchev revelations came down. And that was Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, gave a speech very critical of Stalin, who had come before him. And the Communist Party really didn't have an answer to that. And really, the Communist Party had been an organization of tens of thousands of members, but after 1956, it really, you know, began to collapse. It couldn't really sustain itself. It had no real answer to what had happened in the Soviet Union, and it really didn't function. But there were still young Marxist-Leninists. In the early civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had all kinds of communists and Marxists in it, and there actually became something called the Revolutionary Action Movement. These were students that were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who formed kind of an underground revolutionary communist grouping that they formed. And eventually out of that, the Black Panthers actually sprang out of the RAMS, which was the Revolutionary Action Movement, which was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And here in this city, there was a group called Youth Against War and Fascism. And eventually it spread all around the country. And it began here in New York City when George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the leader of the American Nazi Party, was planning to come to New York City and give a speech. And, you know, New York City is probably the, you know, I mean, there's, I think, a very, very large Jewish population in New York City. There are a number of people who had seen the horrors of the concentration camps, and people were just outraged that this Nazi was going to come to New York City and give a speech. But the Democrats, they said, don't go out and protest, you know, just let him do it. We're a great country, freedom of speech. The reformist socialist leaders said the same thing, just ignore it. But the people in New York City really wanted to organize and protest. And so a group called Youth Against War and Fascism called a demonstration. And people were out in the streets. And pretty soon they had lost control of the city. People were fighting the cops with bricks and rocks. And as George Lincoln Rockwell's car was coming over the bridge from New Jersey, the mayor of New York City brought state troopers and they blocked the road. And as his car came up, they said, turn around. If you come into this city's going to go up in flames. And they turned back his car. Right? That was the first demonstration called by a very revolutionary youth group called Youth Against War and Fascism. But, you know, there are so many, you know, we've been told all our lives that communism is just this far-off thing. I mean, I was shocked when I was, you know, when I was first looking into Marxism, I was shocked that there was even a communist party in the United States, let alone like 200. Right? I was blown away. You know, I didn't even know that anyone believed in Marxism. It's been so buried. But there was a culture of Marxism in this country, and there will be again. And FIST, we are a young organization of revolutionary Marxist-Leninists. We are dedicated to reviving the tradition of struggle. Because you know what? You know, you look at Occupy Wall Street, you look at the people who filled the streets after Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted, and it was a horrific thing. The people who filled the streets, people want to go out and fight against capitalism. They want to organize and they want to resist. But the problem is these rebellions, these upsurges, people going out and doing things, if they just are a place for people to blow off some steam, it doesn't do any good, right? We need to find a way that these uprisings, these things that happen naturally against the capitalist system, can have direction. And they need to be pointed in a way. And we also have to bring a global context into it. The working class in the United States is oppressed and exploited, but compared to people around the world, they have it pretty good because of the exploitation of the third world. I mean, let's be real. Horrific things happen in this country, but horrific things are happening all over the world. And one of the most important things that revolutionaries in this country need to do is to stand in solidarity with revolutionaries around the world. In 2011, Zuccotti Park was being occupied. They occupied Wall Street. But the U.S. government was bombing Libya. And it was bombing Libya. Libya once had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. And now, the bombs, the NATO bombs went in there and they destroyed the country. And it's in ruins. And Occupy Wall Street, as much as they were raging against the 1%, they get their profits from war. And they were bombing and destroying a country. And they didn't have much to say about it. That was a problem, right? We need internationalism. We have to be thinking of it as a global working class. Right now, it's unfortunate. Someone who was supposed to be here and be on this panel right now, it's actually not unfortunate, but he couldn't be here. It's unfortunate he couldn't be here. But Scott, our comrade Scott, is actually in Syria right now, and he's an elections observer, right? In Syria, the U.S. imperialists have been telling the Syrians they don't have the right to have an election. Your country's having a civil war. You don't have the right to have an election. You shouldn't have an election. Well, the Syrians have a scheduled presidential election on June 3rd, and Scott is there to observe it. And he's there with a statement from FIST saying, we stand with you. You have the right to have a presidential election, and there are youth in the United States who are on your side. And you know what? Abraham Lincoln, 150 years ago, exactly 150 years ago in 1864, Abraham Lincoln was elected in the context of a civil war. There was a civil war happening in this country, and the people went out and they voted and they re-elected Abraham Lincoln president of the United States. So I think the Syrians have the right to re-elect their president as the U.S. sends these terrorists that are in there bombing and destroying. Arms are flowing into Syria. Our government, they're cutting food stamps, they're cutting all the programs we depend on, but they're sending guns and weapons to these insurgent groups in Syria to torture and kidnap and murder. This civil war would be over if it weren't for the U.S. putting all of this money and weapons and funding into the insurgent groups. But you know what? When Lincoln was reelected in 1864, and Lincoln was not a communist, Lincoln was a racist, he was a lot of awful things, but Lincoln, when he was reelected in 1864, who endorsed him? Karl Marx. Karl Marx endorsed Abraham Lincoln in 1864 because he said that it was absolutely necessary to fight against slavery in the United States, and that if Lincoln were not reelected, that would be a disaster. That would have meant peace with the Southern slave owners. Marxists, we call the Civil War, we call it the Second American Revolution. It was a social revolution to smash the slaveocracy, right? And I think that Lincoln, Lincoln, he didn't take office on a platform of ending slavery. He said himself he wouldn't have freed a single slave if he didn't have to, but he had to. As soon as he took office on a platform of not allowing slavery to expand, the slave owners, the wealthy slave owners of the South revolted against Lincoln. And so Lincoln aligned with the capitalists in the northern United States, as well as the labor unions, as well as many African Americans all from around the country who volunteered. They went down and they smashed the slaveocracy. They smashed the slaveocracy. And the Second American Revolution is an example of a revolution based on material conditions. You could not have, it was a contradiction, you could not have northern industrial capitalism coexisting with the slaveocracy. The two could not work together. And so as a result, there was a revolt, not a revolt, but a confrontation, and Marxists played a big role in it. Right? And Marxists all over this country, very small grouping, but there were 3 generals in the Union Army, 3 brigadier generals who were members of the Communist League and spoke to Karl Marx personally. And Marx, who was living in London at the time, actually organized strikes of textile workers. Textile, where they get that depends on cotton. And textile was coming from the South. And so textile workers said that we're not going to work with cotton picked by slaves, and they refused to work with cotton. That's the solidarity we need. So I know I've gone on for a little while. I want to hear what people here have to say, and I just want to say that we're part of a tradition. It's about building a revolutionary working class movement, building on the traditions of the past, and fighting for the future. That's what we're all about, and thanks for everyone for coming out. People on the left is run by forces that are so reformist and conciliatory that if you want to sound revolutionary, the only people that sound revolutionary are these fascist people on the right. And I want to be clear, a big part of libertarianism is conspiracy theories. That's a big thing. It's a big part of it. I want to talk about the thing, the tie-up on the thing, and the Rothschilds, and the Illuminati, and the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderbergers, and it's all, there's always some mystical group. And the message is that, capitalism is great, America is great, but there's this problem. There's this cancer that's grown in it. If we just cut it out, then it'll go back to being great again. And that's different than Marxism, because Marxism says it's the problem is the system. That it's the system. These are systemic problems. It's the capitalist trying to make profits. But there's so few people going around and actually preaching that. I think the problem is, it's actually the opposite. The problem isn't that we are going out and using those words. The problem is we're not. If we were out there, if people were familiar with Marxism. And during the 60s, people tell me that if you joined the anti-war movement, you became some sort of Marxist. The question was, what kind? Did you become a Maoist or a Trotskyist or an anarchist? That was the question, But now it's out of people's radar screen. People also tell me that, 30 years ago in this city, if you were walking down the street with a red flag, people would run out of the bar and start beating you up. You communist, what are you doing? Now you walk down the street with a red flag, people might think, is he at a construction site? Or, people don't even know what it is. People don't even have it on their radar screen. And that's the problem. We need to bring back a revolutionary red culture, and that's a big problem. And I feel like there's a need for a mass line, a mass movement, a mass demands. We want free college for all. We can have mass movements. Anyone can come, no matter what their politics. But we also need to be building the communist community, the communist culture that was robbed from us during the McCarthy period. We need to be bringing that back. And you go to any other country in the world, even Western imperialist countries, you have that. You have areas where the communists have a base. And the reason, you talk about these organizations being eliminated in the 60s, the reason they were eliminated is because they never had a mass base. The mass movement of the 60s, it was based in the campuses, it was based in the nationally oppressed communities, but the majority of people in the United States had no relation to the mass movement. It was an alien thing. It was separate from quote-unquote mainstream America. It was. But now we're at a point where quote-unquote mainstream America has had their home foreclosed. Well, sure, not in New York, but New York, but mainstream America's had their home foreclosed. Mainstream America doesn't have jobs, All these issues are affecting people, and we need to go with them and say the problem isn't the thing high up on the thing or the group in the back room that worships goats, and it's not that. The problem is the system. We actually have, it's kind of, they talk about the most obvious explanation is usually the right one. We have the most obvious explanation. We don't have to write a novel. We don't have to write Lord of the Rings to explain why things are bad. We don't. We can, things are bad because there's these rich people, and they own everything. And they are trying to make more money from what they already have, and they don't give a shit about the rest of us. That's the problem. And so we got to get the working class people of the world together and take that money from them and take control of the government and have a government of working people and start building a society for everyone.